Quick question. What is Burma's leading export? Commodities like jade, rubber, and teak might quickly come to your mind. But I would personally argue that Myanmar's most significant export to the global community is far less tangible: the gift of meditation. Rooted in traditions preserved by generation of Burmese monks and lay meditation teachers, this export transcends borders, enriching lives not with material goods, but with tools for mindfulness and insight. Even more amazing, it's a commodity that is freely given without any payment demanded in return. Our podcast frequently explores how this quiet revolution from the Golden Land has touched hearts and minds across the globe. And the interview that follows touches upon similar themes as well. Let's listen in. I'm pleased in this conversation to be joined once again for a second time by Daniel M. Stuart. We spoke on a previous conversation. I suggest listeners to check out if they're interested in the topic. Dan has written a couple of books on SN Goenka, Emissary of Insight and Insight in Perspective, which definitely recommend to our listeners to read in full if this conversation is of interest. And we're going to be picking off from where we left the last conversation and starting to get into some of the pages of his recent book to bring out those points. So, Dan, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down and join us once again.
I'm glad to be here, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So the first question I have is just about this book in general, Insight in Perspective, which is your most recent book that's been published. And I'm curious about how the idea and interest for writing a book like this first arose, what kind of readers you envisioned, because its style leaned towards academic readers, but the content could very much resonate with meditators who are curious about the history of meditation, especially in the Goenka tradition.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'd say this book, it had a long gestation process, and certainly a lot of what's here is related to the previous, more popular styled biography that you mentioned, Emissary of Insight. But really, I mean, generally my audience has always been first and foremost the practitioner, because I feel like that's really what this material is for. It's for the people who are in the tradition. At the same time, being trained as an academic and having academic interests myself, I thought it was very important to make sure that this was geared towards a scholarly audience. This book in particular, I wanted it to be robust and have a lot of like historical data and be really also grounded in conversation with a whole stream of scholarly discourses that have in many ways really influenced popular thought and the minds of practitioners, because it's sort of out there in the larger mainstream. It filters out into the mainstream. So I wanted to sort of hit two audiences, and I was also encouraged at a certain point, like there was a little less engagement with the scholarly audience, and I was encouraged at a certain point to frame it more explicitly in conversation with the scholarly traditions, even though that was sort of there all along if you were to read the footnotes, but really the framing introduction was written at the end, and more explicitly geared towards engaging, framing it as in relationship with the broader scholarly audience. People who read this book also will find out that in many ways, the conversation is in connection with another book that was written in 2013 by the scholar Eric Braun, who wrote this very important and influential book about the Ledi Sayadaw, who was a famous monk. Many people think he was one of the main sources of the insight tradition from Burma. And so actually that book was really influential in sort of how I framed the conversation of this book as well, largely suggesting that there was sort of a gap in the scholarship. And that book did a lot, but there needed to be more. So I think really when I think of the origins of this actual book, it started as a short article, which was supposed to just be a short critique of some of the gaps I saw. And then over the several years of working on the issues, it sort of became a whole book, because it was like this idea, well, I actually need to tell this larger story with a lot of data. It can't just be an article. It can't just be about a specific academic issue. It's actually a whole story here.
Right. And you shared that some drafts of that early thesis or early essay with me some years earlier, and I was just blown away by it. You know, for years I was just waiting for the time when this would be out and be public, because there's so much information here, both in terms of actual data and research and hard facts, combined with analysis and interpretation and just analytical thinking and the framing that I had never seen before. And being, myself, as I would imagine many of these listeners, having their lives shaped by this Vipassana practice as taught by S.N. Goenka, having, to whatever degree we individually might have gone into this tradition, might still practice, it plays such an enormous influence in our lives. And yet they're beyond this mythology of what we're told in the organization. It's incredibly hard to be able to find this information. I mean, you spent 20 years researching and writing these essays, books, biography. I spent 20 years moving my life to Burma and being on the ground and talking to people and visiting places. I don't, you and I don't think we have all the answers, and let alone, that amount of work that we've put into it for the average practitioner to go beyond this mythology and gain this understanding. It's an immensely difficult process. And so that's where I'm curious that how this book has been received by the public. And it's certainly an important work. It's packed with all this information. It needs time to be fully absorbed and processed, which is why I'm glad we're having this conversation, because it's enabling me to go back and read much more carefully and formulate questions from it. And especially for readers, maybe practitioners who start out with strong preconceptions, or maybe even those in the scholarly field, that, as we'll get into in a moment, that there's certain narratives that you break down and try to correct. So I'm wondering what reception you feel comfortable sharing in terms of, from across the board, across the readership, across the feeling of people who've read it. What feedback you've received from those that have read this book?
Yeah, to be honest, I've received minimal feedback so far on this book. A few very serious folks have written me. Some with some pretty extensive engagement, but mostly it hasn't been looked at much, as far as I can tell. It's been sent out to some reviewers, and I think there will be some reviews coming in. I think once it gets reviewed by some academics, there might be a bit more of a conversation around it. But honestly, it's been pretty minimal engagement from my end, although I tend not to be out there selling it or looking for engagement. So it depends. Who knows what kinds of conversations are actually happening out there. But certainly plenty of folks have contacted me wanting to read it. And beyond that, I haven't had a whole lot of interaction over it.
So let's get into some of the ideas that you present in this book. And so the first thing I want to start off with is that you open by saying that there's this single story about the modern insight mindfulness born of a few Southeast Asian reformers reacting to colonialism and scaling up mass meditation, that this narrative has dominated scholarship and been, quote, recapitulated repeatedly with a, quote, minimally informed historical sociology. And so, what exactly, in your view, does that dominant narrative get wrong? And what have been the implications of this flawed narrative?
Right. So I would say the main intervention here is really sort of bringing particular figures to the fore who have been occluded in the story, or at least misdescribed in the story. And so I think, like, generally speaking, a lot of, like I say, there's a lot of truth in the standard narrative we have, right? For sure, there were some reformers. For sure, there were certain traditions that became really influential, and these monastic traditions in Burma in particular were very influential. And for sure, this one tradition by the Mahasi Sayadaw became kind of one of the most dominant forces in this global development. But I think what the contribution I'm trying to make is certain, particularly the lay traditions and where they come from, and particularly the role of S.N. Goenka had not been done very well, because it was easier to tell the story about the Mahasi tradition, because it was more straightforward. And there weren't these weird personalities that I discuss in this book, and there was sort of a bit of a less esoteric thing going on, and there was also a little bit more of a clear fit with classical Buddhist models of thought, and a little bit of a less hybrid relationalities that we see with S.N. Goenka in particular, coming to India with his identity sort of not quite fitting with the standard story we have. So yeah, it's I think the main intervention here is when you pay attention to specific details of individuals, and don't just sort of tell a story and reduce it to a kind of like one whole idea, right? Things get much more complicated and complex and difficult to really sort out at the historical level. And I'm trying to do that to some extent, while at the same time acknowledging, as you said, that like the whole story and the bigger story is always going to be in some ways out of reach, because historically it's hard to really get down to it. Just one example, a friend of mine just a few days ago sent me like a historical document from, I think it was from Canada in the early years when this tradition was getting going, that sort of gave some additional information that I was unaware of about some of the conversations that were happening in the early 80s about some of the schismatic things that I write about in this book. That's a historical document that now I see it and I'm like, oh, this could have been added to the to the agenda in terms of understanding how things work. And I say that, I think, at a few places in the book, that actually, in fact, the stories that I'm telling here are partial and in fact need to be filled in by the people who were more involved and have more information. The issue we have in part with doing this kind of work is that a lot of the folks involved in what happened historically are still around and alive, but have remained silent for various reasons about what things that happened historically, how history developed with these traditions. And that's sort of one of the biggest challenges in writing this book, is that in many ways, some of the data and information I've brought out in this book, people didn't really want to deal with or talk about because it just complicated things. And my goal is to complicate things in this context as a scholar. And so that's been an interesting dynamic in my work as a scholar and my history and connection to the tradition as a practitioner.
Why do you think that was, that certain people with archival information who were present during the years of parts of the transmission and establishment of this practice in various places. Why do you think it is that they don't want to talk and don't want that part of the story known?
Well, I think in part there were conflicts between some of the key players in particularly in these lineages that I'm discussing in the book, the Ubakin lineage. Sayaji Ubakin, who was the teacher of S.N. Goenka, was one of these very important early lay teachers in post-colonial Burma. And sort of his students, right, the dynamics that developed as they spread his teachings globally, they don't have a great look in certain ways when we look at some of the conflicts that arose. And so I think the idea within the tradition was just to not talk about conflict. It's actually a very smart thing to do if you want to just, do the work of teaching the Dharma and getting on with the important, work of transmission. But for me as a scholar, it actually seemed quite central to like how the transmission happened and to understanding how like the teachings changed or what was left out of the teachings or what the dynamics were in terms of what got like who ended up being the most dominant force historically. So some of those things that we wouldn't necessarily love to talk about, it seemed central to talk about them if we want to understand what happened. And so if there are two different jobs, if your job is to just keep teaching the Dharma and you think like conflict is going to be unhelpful for that, you want to avoid talk of it. You want to avoid, complicating issues in people's minds. If you're a scholar, you want to complicate things and make things more complex.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, the biggest challenge of being a scholar practitioner, where we hope we have both of these ideals in mind at different times. And, we want to sort of cover all our bases. And that's a very challenging task. Particularly if you want to be part of a tradition and a community.
Right. And you referenced in the last episode that we recorded the kind of lonely feeling of being on the outside of that community with these questions. I think that there's a lot of lonely practitioners out there, given the feedback that we've received from this episode and others that we've done with Jonathan Crowley, with Gustav Hauptmann, with Friedgard Lottermoser, among many others, is that that feeling that they're not so lonely hearing these kinds of conversations. And I think that's also very interesting to look at this dynamic between the incentives and motivations of those that want to keep the tradition, the so-called purity of the tradition, and the messaging of it with, pesky scholars or pesky podcast hosts, or, Friedgard Lottermoser, who's probably the peskiest of all because, she actually has firsthand memories and crystal clarity from, the time spent with Ubakin and Webu Sayadaw and Goenka and some others. And this does kind of conflict with this story that's being told. And so, yet at the same time, I think that there's enormous demand and hunger for wanting to hear these things and engage critically. And engaging critically doesn't mean shutting down or winning an argument or scoring points. Engaging critically just means a wider, more critical discussion of what these matters are and how they influence us and how they influence the teachings that were brought to us, and kind of fleshing that out. And I think that's where, the feedback that we've received from some of these conversations has been appreciated. And that's also where, I think your book is one part of that, that process coming out now of more learning taking place that's been available before. And I do think there are, the Goenka technique has reached so many people around the world that I think there is an interest and curiosity in hearing beyond the words that are coming from the 10-day discourse.
Sure. And I think thinking of Friedgard Lottermoser is kind of a very helpful point, because she's a good example of someone who was quite outspoken and had her own take on things and really did her own thing. But also she was hesitant to share broadly some of her ideas, right? And so even I think you're aware, because she did these conversations with you and then said, actually, I'd prefer that until I die, we don't we don't talk
Yeah.
about some of this stuff. Right.
Right.
So that's an amazing example
Yeah.
of a kind of choice not to mess around too much with things precisely for some of the reasons that I'm talking about, right? Obviously, she still shared all broadly, and in fact, conversations with her, I didn't have a lot of contact with her, but some very key pieces of data were shared with me by her that came into my book and were helpful. But I think it's just a good example of like the different kinds of choices we make, right, for different reasons, and she made that choice because she cared intensely about the tradition. And she made the choice to wait till she passed away, but also to do it, right? So that's a very good example of sort of the kinds of weird tensions that are there, particularly within this very close-knit community, and when there's faith towards a teacher, and you respect, in a sense, this feeling of, oh, we need to keep some things within the tradition, right? Some things that have to be esoteric to some extent. Friedgard, for instance, had translated this short book that Khin wrote on meditation, but when I discussed publishing it with her, she was hesitant to publish it because she thought, well, actually, this is only for people within the tradition. We shouldn't publish it and have it spread widely in translation, which was interesting. We disagreed on that point, actually, she and I. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Friedgard, it took a decade to even convince her to start talking to me. We talked offline, but it took her a lot of years to convince her to have those conversations. And as you say, they came with that condition, and she was, it was a massive decision for her. And I understood, and I respected the sensitivity, because she was gauging on one side the realization that she had knowledge that no other living person in this world had, and that knowledge was going to leave with her, and that she had a responsibility to bring this knowledge into the world. But on the flip side of that, having a responsibility with knowledge also means that if it's shared the wrong way, or with the wrong person, or in the wrong context, or with the wrong motivation, that it can actually do more harm by sharing it. And so, whether to share, what to share, how to share, when to share, all of those things were incredibly critical decisions for her, and very, very tough. And, definitely we had a lot of back and forth about, her, about her willingness to want to share, and then eventually with those conditions she felt comfortable. But then once she started, she just blossomed. I mean, she was so happy, and her sense of holding this stuff in, and being cautious, once she found an avenue for being able to be heard, to be listened to go into depth with these stories and have them appreciated and have them understood. I mean, she was so joyous, and so much warmth and radiance just broke out in her. And, very sadly, she passed away. I mean, we were planning to spend quite a bit more time throughout the years an intensive recording, because there was so much more that she wanted to share, and so much more that her life held. And certainly, it's been Jonathan Crowley, he spoke on our podcast at length, took a number of years for him to feel comfortable, yourself as well. These are, whether it's writing something in a book, or speaking on a podcast, or another type of avenue, these are, people take their way to get to them, and to feel comfort, and to weigh kind of the advantages and disadvantages of what it is to put some things in the public discourse.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to move on then, and to broaden our scope, and situating the Goenka tradition as well, Khin tradition, as well as the wider traditions, into what has been called Buddhist modernism. And you argue in your book that scholars have routinely funneled diverse traditions into this frame of Buddhist modernism, this concept, despite your finding that the traditions that you've studied, quote, do not hew to the contours of that category. And so what concrete historical or practice features do you find are falling outside this modernism frame?
I mean, there are a lot of them, but I do think basically, once you've decided, okay, here's what I'm looking for, there are these categories that I'm looking to fill in. Um, the easy thing to do then is once you fill them in is to not bother with whatever else is there, right? And so in the case of the lay practitioners that I was trying to understand, these are, in the lineage, Maungpo Tet, who was Sayaji Ubekin's teacher, and then Sayaji Ubekin, and then Goenka, and Sayama, who was also Mother Sayama, who was also Ubekin's student, um, trying to understand like what their main approach to meditation was and how they did what they were doing. It wasn't actually that helpful to call them modernists. Like I could say, okay, maybe they fit in certain ways with some of these categories, but what they were really up to sort of falls outside of these categories. So if I'm just trying to fill my boxes, I lose track of that, right? So particularly important is the role of, you know, supernormal powers that these teachers had, their particular capacities to do interpersonal work with students, and much of that, right, sort of doesn't quite fit into a standard modernizing idea about what meditation is, where it's scientized, it's rendered rational, all of these kinds of things. That's just one very basic example, but there's kind of a lot of this stuff that was undergirding the mission that Ubakin and his students had, that really doesn't just, it's not that Buddhist modernism isn't useful, and it has a huge purchase. I mean, and it's clearly a lot of what it's describing is going on. It's that if you reduce everything to it, you miss out on a lot. And in this case, I think you often actually miss out on really what's like the most important stuff that's going on, that's really driving the traditions. And that in fact sort of sparks the global development of Buddhist meditation, particularly among the lay practitioners in this lineage that we're looking at, it turns out really was one of the most influential traditions in sparking this larger global development that has become, huge in all these different ways, particularly the medicalization of mindfulness, which really only makes sense if you look at Goenka and understand his role in the process.
What's so interesting about this, though, is that there are kind of paradoxical discourses that are happening at the same time about whether you're coming from a rationalist scientific framework or from a more talking about supernatural magical powers part. Certainly from some of the history I've read, there was motivation from some Buddhists in the mid 20th century themselves to want to portray their religion as kind of less of this kind of magical backwoods, spirit, like kind of deep spiritual thing, and on a par with normal organized religions. And so wanting to bring out Buddhism on par with some other major religions, and then through that, as the decades went on, then meditation became really a perfect vehicle for describing the scientific mind-body relationship. And you see that across Buddhist modernism. Certainly, Goenka is a large part of that. Not the only actor in that. You see that message coming out in from different actors and different traditions, but certainly as part of Goenka himself as well. But what's interesting with this is that as you become involved more with the Goenka organization, just to stick on that one, as you get deeper into the tradition, these conversations of supernatural issues, magical things, I mean, this is part and parcel of a lot of conversations you have the more deeply you get inside the tradition and taking long courses and talking to old students and teachers and such. And yet it's very much something that's not shared from the outset. And so there's this kind of contradiction of kind of inside outside speak of what you're centering on, what you're focusing. And then I imagine that would also start to shape and affect how people outside the tradition that aren't practicing, such as scholars or as you mentioned in the medical field or psychology or something, are looking at it. And so how do we understand these kind of simultaneous, almost contradictory discourses that are taking place inside and outside rationalist and supernatural?
Well, that's why I like to push it all the way back into the history, because I think, you point out that this was happening in the like mid 20th century, early 20th century already. It was actually happening in the 19th century. But what's interesting, particularly if we take Ledi Sayadaw as an example, and this is, I've written some of this material is in the book, but also I wrote a separate article about this, when also discussing this figure, Leon Wright, who was this important Christian student, Black American Christian student of Sayadaw Khin, who I think you did a podcast on at some point. But if we look at the Ledi Sayadaw's framing of the relationship between, Buddhism and Christianity and its connection to healing, we see him actually using religion, right, precisely not as a rationalized thing, but in fact as a more cosmological idea, right, talking about angels and healing and this kind of stuff in connection with the deities and healing and stuff like that. And this is, in the early 20th century. So precisely this is the point, is that in fact, earlier on the discourses were quite different, right? And in fact, maybe even the process of rationalization was different, and the category of religion looked different in the early 20th century than what it becomes for Goenka in his particular moment later on, when he's trying to sort of really kind of ease the minds of his more explicitly rationalist students, and really create a sort of global discourse that everyone can accept who's in a more secularized context. And it's always easier to fit romantic cosmological religious ideas into a secularized rational framework than the other way around. Although we might argue about that, but I think that was at least the choice that he made, right? And so that's why, as you're saying, it tends to be that structure of the conversation process. Like, we get a certain package, we come for meditation for certain reasons, and then we find, oh, there's other stuff going on, and then we enter into these deeper conversations, and then we find there's this whole layer that's there and that has always been there, and that in fact goes back to the earliest teachings, right? But it's a question one wonders, right, depending on who's coming to the conversation or why someone came to meditation in the first place, right, which direction it goes. There of course are many people who come to meditation, or at least in my generation, I think this has changed more and more as the generations change, but people came to meditation for the kind of mystical and the different and the religious, and we're trying to escape the kind of modern, rational, secular, or whatever. So that's a question. I don't know, like for you, for instance, which direction did you come from when you came at it?
Well, two things drove me to it. I mean, one was that I had a deep interest in the subconscious and and having a spiritual experience, as many young people in the West probably do, wanting something different, wanting to get at the truth, these deep things. And yet in my, being in my early 20s and living in Asia and having a lot of excitement in my life, it was kind of like, well, yeah, let me have a lot of excitement and fun first, and then when I have enough of that, let me go find these deep spiritual truths. But as life happened, I had something happen personally that gave me tremendous trauma and pain, which I had no other solution to, and was drowning in. And so when I heard from a coworker in Tokyo about this meditation I was trying to practice in Japan, but the only I didn't know anything about Vipassana or Zen or anything else. I just wanted some meditation, partly for the spiritual truth and partly for this relief of this trauma. And the only traditions I found in Japanese Buddhism, you had to sit zazen, you had to sit, or you had to sit full lotus, sorry, and I could barely sit cross-legged, just not flexible. And so when a coworker in Tokyo told me about the Goenka tradition, and I quickly checked that I did not have to sit full lotus or half lotus, then I thought this is exactly what I'm looking for, and that drove me to it. And I think, like many people, whatever it was, I think many people come to meditation and come to an intensive meditation course for different reasons. But then once you get in the flow of what it is they're teaching and and the deeper kind of truths you realize, whatever it was that was driving you there can sometimes change and transform along the way, partly through the conditioning of the organization and partly through your own internal process of development into and become something else altogether.
Indeed.
So one of the things I also want to ask you, because when you're talking about these different reasons that people come to a tradition and then what they're practicing in it, the fact that there is this kind of rationalist scientific message, and we would say in the case of Goenka, extremely non-sectarian. I think there's probably some Goenka practitioners out here that are already up in arms that we're calling anything Buddhism or Buddhist that has to do with the tradition, because there's been such an emphasis on saying that it's not Buddhist. But to leave that aside for a moment, there is this message of coming to the tradition for these more secular messaging that's bringing people in. And yet, as you get deeper in, you do, through the meditation practice itself, as well as the conversations with old students, you do tap into this more supernatural, magical kind of mythology that's there. And so, that dynamic, do you see that as something that could be seen as deceitful or manipulative or dishonest, or do you see it more as like, well, you always have to tell people? I'm thinking when the recent podcast conversation with Gustav Hauptmann, when I asked him this, he said, look, when you're talking to these meditators from around the world, they don't know the history of Burma, they don't know the lineage of SN Goenka. You have to tell them some story that's not going to be totally perfect and totally accurate, but it just kind of captures basically what the tradition and the practice is, and it gets them in the door. And then and they don't need to know everything, but it's enough for them to have a certain background. So do you see it as something that's more on the manipulative or dishonest side, or do you see it more as like, well, with any new topic, you have to kind of condense it, and whenever you condense it, you're getting to places that aren't exactly accurate in different ways, but they're enough for people to understand?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Gustav Hauptmann. I mean, usually I agree with him. He's been very influential
Yes.
in my own work, and he spent a lot of years in Burma, and he's just a very thoughtful scholar. On the other hand, he's not all that familiar with what Goenka was up to and all of that. But I would say it's hard to know really, because it can appear sometimes that like there's some explicit, I don't know if it would be dishonesty, but for sure manipulation that is like choosing the right story to tell. But that's like what everyone does, and I think that's what Gustav Hauptmann is pointing out, right? And I think it's more of the question is what did Goenka believe himself? And here's the thing where it's like, actually, it seems really likely he thought that these were amenable ways of talking, and it only becomes a problem if one doesn't feel that they're amenable, right? That like the rationalist and the magical can somehow like be there side by side. And so I think I would say that Goenka believed everything he said and was really committed and convinced. But that's why it's different to do the work as a scholar who's looking at these frameworks as whole big picture frameworks that really, in certain moments come into conflict and other moments can be reconciled. But when you're hanging out with the people going through it, like hanging out with all the people who are in these traditions and sort of come up against problems, either in their practice or in their conceptual framing of things, or spending like a decade doing one thing and then thinking, well, actually, I must have been doing something else, right? then it starts looking like more of a problem, right? Because it brings problems into people's lives, and they then experience these practices as challenges. And for someone like Goenka, who was so committed and invested to the power of these practices, like all of that is fine because it's sort of the point of the practice, right? But if one comes to the practice with a different point and then realizes that this was the other point, then it can be pretty hard, right? It can be challenging, it can be painful, it can be disruptive, it can be traumatic.
Yeah.
And this is, a whole strand of the modern engagement with some of these practices, right? That I don't know if we discussed this in our last podcast, but my colleagues at Braun who are looking at difficult meditation experiences. Now my colleague Pierce Salguero has a collection of historical documents about challenging meditative experiences being documented from very early on in the history of Buddhist meditation practice. This kind of stuff. So it's more just like what I think the big picture question is: what frameworks are we in, or do we think we're in? What do we expect when we come to meditation, and then what do we get? And then put all those pieces together, and it can look like a hot mess.
Wow.
And part of what this book is about is giving people some of the historical resources to like know what the mess is ahead of time. And theoretically, that could be useful. Theoretically, it could be not useful. It could be overly complicated,
Yeah.
right? Which is what Gustav Hauptmann is pointing out. You have to give people a simple
Right.
story that they get and that'll get them in the door. If one gives out a overly complicated, challenging story, it could drive people away, right? And this is one of the major concerns of the tradition when talking about the complexities of these histories.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And you're also hitting upon kind of like who needs to know this information, who is this information important to, in terms of practitioners and scholars. Gustav Hauptmann referencing that normal practitioners just on their first 10-day course don't exactly need to know the colonial history of Burma and how that fits into the meditation, their instructions they're hearing on day 3 or whatever it is. But for scholars, it's a different story. And you do write in your book that many scholars retell this story of modern meditation without really paying attention to the specific contours of Burmese history, which you find very strange. I do as well. Why do you think it is that Burmese history has been left out of some of these accounts on the part of scholars? And how does bringing it back change the way we understand the development of modern insight practice?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think it's sort of the same in scholarship as it is elsewhere. Simpler stories catch on more easily. And this is like, it's a good example. So if I read Robert Scharf's article on critiquing meditative experience as like mostly modes of rhetoric, right? It gives this very simple story about Burmese Vipassana, right, as this sort of one idea. And then if I look at Gustav Hauptmann's book on the politics of Burmese meditation, it's just highly layered and idiosyncratic and nuanced and actually really hard to like pull apart, right? So even as a scholar who's like, well trained in complexity, like it's much easier for me to take Bob Scharf's ideas and cite them and go run on my merry way, especially if I'm not that interested in Burma and I'm looking at global developments, right? Then like wade through the really layered and challenging ideas presented by Gustav Hauptmann's like anthropological lens. So this is where I distinguish between the sociological historiography, right, and a kind of anthropological lens. They really do sort of different kinds of work, and then it's not like we should use both, obviously. But yeah, the sort of reduction of the socio historical sometimes ends up oversimplifying, I would say. And it's just easy no matter what, whether you're a practitioner or whether you're a scholar. Like the simpler story tends to win out. Yeah.
Right. So then let's get more into some of these messy details, some of this complication that we keep talking around, and let's get to the heart of it. And let's start with Lady's Manual of Insight. And you reference how Eric Braun has very much framed this as a product of colonial pressures and Abhidhamma scholasticism. And that has suggested that mass meditation has arisen out of a particular historical moment. But on the contrary, you argue that Ladies Project, it can't simply be reduced to an output of colonialism, since the work was deeply embedded in traditional Buddhist cosmology and local dynamics. And so how do you see Ladies' teachings as standing apart from the colonial narrative? And what do we miss if we only see them through that lens?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say like we should totally ignore the. I mean, obviously,
Right,
it's
right.
actually central to my argument here. It's
Yeah.
like that actually the colonial piece is, of course, very important, just like Braun says. However, the way he engages in it is problematic. That is like focusing on the Manual of Insight as this pinnacle development of Letty's scholarship when he wrote, hundreds of manuals. They're filled with really a huge range of stuff. And the Manual of Insight, or the Vipassana Dipani, is one of the least engaged by the local populace. It was written for a Western audience, which is, of course, why, like Braun engages it, but it doesn't seem like it ever really had much of a role in meditation practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the traditions that actually become influential in really developing like mainstream mass meditation, right? So the critique is not like, oh, we shouldn't focus on colonialism. It's that we shouldn't like look for certain things that fit why we should focus on colonialism. Colonialism matters for certain reasons, but really we have to look in this deeper way at what was going on. And in many ways, some of the responses to colonialism were precisely the opposite of the Vipassana Dipani, right? Of the Manual of Insight. They were not rational. They were not, or rather hyper rational. They weren't like, I note that in fact the Abhidhamma stuff gets sidelined in many contexts because it's too complicated, right? And it's actually a simplifying mode of meditation that we're dealing with, right? Um, and then you lose track of the interpersonal teacher-student relationship when we're just talking about these scholastic manuals, right? All these different aspects of why that focus is unhelpful. But I'm not really saying that we shouldn't focus on colonialism. I'm just saying
Mm-hmm.
it can distort our way of doing things if we make that the only thing and then look at, for instance, texts through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt that the Legisida was influenced by the colonial context, and that colonialism was a hugely powerful force in so many of the dynamics that were going on. Particularly when we talk about Sayagyi Uba Khin in his context, the fact that he was teaching to non-Buddhists, all of whom were working in his office, and they were sort of leftovers of a colonial legacy, right? You had these Indians there as part of the larger British Empire, right? That had so it's obviously connected to that, but it's more that how we do our historical work in connection to that has to be nuanced. So that's the real argument and the real critique.
Right. So thanks for clarifying that. And then if we're seeing that this colonial focus, which as you say is certainly important, but when it dominates and drowns out the other views, then we don't see them for what they are. And some of those other views are how central the supernatural was in Ladies' thinking. So to focus on that for a moment, from the protective recitations to battles with unseen forces that we see, I mean, all these things we see continuing in very similar ways down the lineage in later decades. You suggest that there's a kind of discomfort on the part of scholars with these non-Western worldviews that has led them to downplay or to misinterpret these aspects, in addition to where the colonial focus comes in. And so how would you describe how Lady Sayadaw interacted with the supernatural, and what is it we lose when this gets ignored in this story of modern meditation and mass meditation movement?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a huge amount of data on really how the Legisida interacted, but there is particularly this one manual he wrote, the Rogantara Dipani, right, which is about healing remedies during times of plague, And we see in there, and I've, again, this article I mentioned discusses this, and I use this in a number of places in the book, just to elucidate that, yeah, he was engaging in this stuff pretty much on a day-to-day basis, right? Like it was sort of just part of lived reality. And I think anyone who spent time in Myanmar or in Burma and hung out will see that this, like the Nats and the local devas and are a big part of life there, right? Deities and local spirits and mediumship. It runs through a lot of the daily practices that are going on. And so the point to make is that, the larger development of Vipassana can't really be separated from the whole larger cultural ethos, right? And when Goenka took this practice outside of Burma, like it seemed easy to just remove those cultural aspects. But since they were in fact fundamental to how the practices were taught, how the teachers were engaging their students, right? They actually remained central, though they were downplayed in terms of public conversations because they wouldn't make sense to someone outside of the cultural context in which these things are playing out. And so, but for sure, like we have very good examples on the ethnographic record of Goenka making many of his decisions based on consultation with non-human forces and things like that. So, and it's more clear like what Goenka was doing in that connection than what the Ledi Sayadaw was doing, because we're further removed in history from that.
And so then just following up on that last anecdote you gave, just jumping ahead for a moment before we go back to Lady, I want to ask a question that actually came in the form of a comment on our recent podcast episode that we recorded from one listener that wanted to follow up with something that you had said in that conversation. He wanted to know if Venkatriam had the opportunity to confirm the authenticity of U Ba Khin's technique or teachings, because you had kind of started that story of saying how when we were looking at what is authentic, how do we determine authenticity, and you had described some of the divinations and supernatural work that U Ba Khin and some of his disciples were doing, Venkatriam going to these different spiritual planes and trying to confirm the authenticity in that way. I guess this was a question wanting to know, well, did he really do it? And the follow-up question is, what is the historiographic evidence that we have for these claims about Venkatriam?
Right. So Venkataraman was his name. And right, I think the story, I don't know which story I told in the podcast, but he was a student of U Ba Khin and then was used by him for his psychic powers. And I think the story that gets told is like how they found the center, right? They found the meditation center, the land, and they brought Venkataraman there, and he communed with the guardian deities of the Dharma, and they told him, this is the place for a Dharma center. This is a powerful piece of land. So the idea is already he was in communication with these, what would be known as Dhammapalas, right? Protector deities of the Dharma. Which would already have been conceptualized as proof that, of course, they have the right teachings, because these are the guardian deities of the Dharma who are there helping out, right? Mm-hmm. But whether that was the explicit goal of Venkataraman, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. I actually did see that question on the website. I'm not quite sure what exactly the question is after, but this would have been something to ask Friedgard Lottermoser, because she has some very interesting information about that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But actually, we're limited in what we know about Venkataraman. This was really just from like Ukole's biography, which was preserving some of U Ba Khin's diary. So he took that from U Ba Khin's own diary about going and visiting the site. And Venkataraman not much gets talked about in terms of his role, but he was important early on. And I think I told one story about him that I heard directly from one of my informants who meditated with him, and they did this sort of like metta practice and he could see some blockage that he had or something. So early on, Ubakin was using him as an aid to help his meditation students.
And we should say that Ubakin's diary, which is in English, still exists to this day, but very, very few people in the world have seen this. And I don't know if how many we'll ever get to.
Yeah, let's hope. I mean, I think his son was maybe considering publishing it, but let's see if that ever happens.
Yeah, I had spoken to his son, and he, I mean, at least in the conversation I had, he seemed less than enthusiastic about making this public for reasons I didn't understand. But I understand it's in his family. It's his descendants have it now, but and yeah, I'll cut myself off there because I've heard other things I don't want to publicly say, but just to reference that, I think this is one of the prime documents out there that I think there would certainly be reasons, huge advantages to wanting to read it and see it, and I think from other quarters there would be motivation to wanting to make sure that it's not seen.
Sure. Yeah.
So then going back to, as we're talking about Lady Sayadaw and the sidelining of the supernatural, it brings up this concept that you've referenced in the book as well as in your essay on Leon Wright, which is erasure, and this sense of erasure of stories that we tell, and of stories that we tell from non-Western actors, an African-American in the form of Leon Wright, or a Burmese and Lady Sayadaw, or some of the others in the tradition, that it's not just kind of something that's happening, but it can be put in the category of, through Western lens, an erasure of something that's uncomfortable or not seen or not understood. So how do you understand erasure, and how would you put some of these, some of what's getting missed in the category of being erased either intentionally or unintentionally?
Yeah, so I do think the language of erasure is helpful, because in some cases it's really clear, like there are choices to remove material or to not look at things. But actually, I think what's a better way of talking is about the notion of legibility. I mean, I think generally in these contexts, it becomes easier to, quote, erase things that are hard to communicate across cultural boundaries or don't fit into a simple story, as we've talked about, because they're not that legible unless you have the bigger picture, or unless you're on the ground in the culture, or unless you sort of understand some things that would take time to figure out. So, for instance, when I wrote that article about Leon Wright, the language I used was trying to make someone more legible as like a thicker kind of person, and we've thinned people out more. So it's, there is a process of erasure or forgetting, or a deliberate, like, editing of oneself, for instance, which is definitely what Goenka did historically, or editing his own teacher's identity. But I think of it more as like a thinning out of something that's much thicker and deeper and has more quality, as opposed to like a full erasure. In a sense, that's like this postmodern idea of the palimpsest, which is, you can never really fully erase anything. And you have these remnants and these accretions that are always going to be there, but it's more like how one relates to it. Like, can we see the traces? Why can't we see them? Or why wouldn't we see them? What's disallowing us from seeing these things? What holds us back? And when is it advantageous to notice? When is it advantageous to not notice or to ignore? Or, as if you go all the way to fully try to remove, which is pretty hard to do, to really go all the way with that. So yeah, that's how I would talk about that issue. I mean, it's of course a very big, deep issue, like in history. So, some of the classic ideas around this are people who work with gender, like my wife, who studied the early nuns, for instance, and came across this huge problem of the voice of nuns, right? Like, where do we see them? How do we get them? Right.
Mm.
We, in the Buddhist tradition, we have this terikata, right? The voices of Buddhist nuns. It seems to be some of the oldest possible autobiographical literature of women that we have on record. And it's amazing stuff. And it probably is, but some have argued that, well, this is actually probably authored by men.
Mm.
um, and so again, like, the language of erasure is interesting, but the other language is representation of someone who's been erased by someone else,
Mhm.
right? And this is more of the challenge, right, that we have here, is that we in fact have positive representations of people and things, and then you have other information that doesn't quite fit with it, and then that makes that renders the question like who is this person then really? And so the notion of legibility is helpful, because it's like you bring this new information in, and what you thought was there before starts to transform and look different, and become more legible, to our perception, and then a fuller, thicker, deeper picture of who these people were, of what life was like, what these practices were really about, comes into our consciousness.
Mhm. I want to move next to a series of conversations about the role of the Abhidhamma, because the way the focus that you treat it with in your book, and trying to correct the narrative that has been presented previously, is a large part. And so we could start with, you contend that Braun misreads Lady as privileging a dry approach justified by Abhidhamma logic. Instead, you show that Lady prioritized sutta categories, and that the Abhidhamma was and denied, actually, that Lady denied that the Abhidhamma was necessary for most practitioners. Can you say more about how you develop this belief and the implications of this correction?
I mean, I think it's clear that the Abhidhamma was central in so much of the Ledi Sayadaw's scholarship. And the question really is, what's the relationship to these lay focused meditation practitioners, right? And how much of the Abhidhamma was really driving what they were doing, right? And so we have very clear cases where the Ledi Sayadaw says those things, and then we have these clear cases where he's talking about teaching lay people, which was not something he did a lot of. And when he is doing that, he's using the suttas. Um, so that's clear. Then we have his students, the lay students, Maungpotet, Sayagyu, Bakin, and Goenka, who very clearly were mostly focusing on suttas. That doesn't mean the Abhidhamma wasn't important. This is the same thing with the argument about colonialism. The Abhidhamma was always conceptualized as important. It's like the mainstream of these traditions. The question is how much of it was really like on the ground being deployed in meditation contexts, right? For sure, Maungpotet, um, Ubakin, and Goenka all learned Abhidhamma. They wanted to know it. They knew it was important and thought it was important. They rarely actually deployed it in their teachings of meditation and in how they taught meditation. Particularly, Ubakin was very experimental. He was just trying to figure stuff out,
Yeah.
on the ground, and it just really doesn't seem like, I think he would go to some of Ledi's manuals and go to the text and try to sort of confirm things, but really he just figured stuff out on the fly, and he also had his psychic supporters to help him feel confident about these things. And these people had no Abhidhamma education. Mother Sayama was not a scholar. She did not study Abhidhamma. Venkataraman was a Hindu. He did not study Abhidhamma. He must have learned something from Ubakin, right? But this was much more direct. The way that the understanding of these practices were being engaged was much more direct, than the scholastic models that Sayadaw was working with earlier on in his monastic communities. So I think, yeah, it's more like seeing how these things really filter into practice contexts. And the idea that the Abhidhamma loses its like real utility when you're on the ground just dealing with day-to-day practices. It gets drawn on in certain moments that are when it's necessary, particularly in moments when authority needs to be demonstrated. Or like in Ubakin's treatise, he on meditation, he draws on the Abhidhammata Sangaha a few times, not very much, honestly, but a few times to show his erudition. So yeah, that's sort of the key point is like, again, if we focus on scholasticism, if we focus on coloniality, they're key pieces, but if they orient us away from what was really going on the ground for practitioners, for like individuals, then we lose track of what really happened. And that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, it's very interesting how there's these threads to the conversation of how colonialism on one hand, on one end of it, and on the other end, the transmission of this technique to and overall mindfulness practice to the West and the rationalist approach it needed to take, how much this contributes to erasure or to misunderstanding or to looking away. And so it's refreshing to be able to go back in and try to see it for what it was at the time without these filters in place. Again, not to say these are not extremely relevant issues, but that sometimes they cloud in the way of understanding how things were then. And so with that in mind, examining the context in which Lady was living and teaching, you tie in recital groups, examinations, protective suttas, and to this grand cosmological outlook, even a cosmic battle. I think when we hear the words cosmic battle, I think there's some questions as to what does that mean in relation to recitals or Abhidhamma study. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, actually, this is interesting and something I would actually point folks to the research work of my colleague P. Pyo Cha at Oxford University, who's done some really interesting work on Abhidhamma recitation, particularly the Patana, which is one of these very important texts, in fact, that Uba Khin recited as one of his major protective texts, and that is played, in fact, on tapes at every SM Goenka course that's ever done globally. She's done some really interesting work on this, the role of these protective texts in day-to-day life, but also the idea that the examinations in some ways are kind of enacting this stuff as well. But also within meditation communities, that the protective aspect of this is central. And it's interesting. She talks about these texts being able to do two things. One is to ward off evil forces, and the other is to draw in powerful positive forces, which are protective. Right. So when we think of like a cosmic battle on those terms, that's what we're thinking about. Right. I mean, this actually goes back to all the Indic traditions, this notion that there's a perennial kind of tension between dark and light forces, deities and asuras in certain contexts. And in the Buddhist tradition, that would be one of the key dynamics, right? The forces of Mara would be one other way of talking about the sort of darker side of things in the Buddhist context. But the idea here is that the Dharma, the teachings, whether they're the suttas or the Abhidhamma, are very powerful because they draw in the good forces. They bring deities around because why? The deities want to hear the Dharma, right? I mean, many of the suttas we have were taught to deities, right? That's just the tradition. So the idea here is if you recite the Dharma, you will bring deities to come and listen to it, and their forces will be protective. That is, they'll drive away the dark forces that might be around. And according to the Ledisada, they're around, they're everywhere, and it's constant. And so that's when I use that language, which is, granted, quite evocative. This notion of a cosmological battle happening all the time. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. And you find this really, it's not like everywhere, but particularly in some of these these texts were the Letiside, us talking about illness and affliction and stuff like that.
And so then if scriptural study in Abhidhamma is serving this protective role, not so much a modernizing one, it calls into question, do we need to reframe the way we look at the relationship between pariyatti and practice in Ladies' formulation?
Well, I think it's in part we need to reframe what modernizing actually is. Right. So if we look at that as part of the process of modernization, we just have to realize that, in fact, these aspects of what we thought were maybe non-modern are, in fact, part of modernity. Now, the question is how one wants to relate to them. But also, if we don't want to include them in the modern category, then we just have to think differently about what the process was in terms of how that stuff was going on. And this is a complicated question because the category of modernity is a complicated one.
Yeah.
And this is something that, in fact, is, probably a bit much for us to delve into too much here. But I do think there's a certain point where people get involved in these practices for other reasons. And when they find out this stuff is going on, they're going to think, well, is this what I want to be up to?
Right.
Right. And so that's, again, for me, one of those interesting questions of like, is this the whole piece of it? Now, this is where I would say when Goenka talks about the other side of it, like the rational, et cetera, I really don't think that he thought there was a conflict between these two structures or these two frameworks. I think he thought you could talk about them both. They could both be real in their own way, in their own spheres. And this is, of course, something that has been done by religious studies scholars for a long time. Right? The notion of that religion has its own place and, the secular has its own place, and they can stand next to each other and the frameworks can sort of be preserved in parallel or something like this. But not everyone will agree with that or find that satisfying, particularly if you're coming to do a practice and you want one thing and then somehow you have some experience and they're getting explained to you in a way that doesn't work for you, like in that moment because you have another framework or something like that. So the idea of allowing for multiple frameworks is not comfortable for everybody.
I'd agree. And I'd add, especially when that's not presented from the start and it comes out in surprising ways through the process.
Indeed. I think that's also one of the things that makes it very challenging for some people.
And, this isn't accidental in terms of whatever it was that came from Goenka within the tradition. There is there feels, for lack of a better word, there feels to be a kind of need to know vibe in terms of like the and I think you saw this with Friedgard as well, is that she was there were meditative insights that she had, and I mean not just her own meditative insights, but just insights into what people were thinking and saying and believing in the tradition, that she herself was unsure, should this information get out at all? Well, and if the answer was yes, the question was, I know that she withheld a lot of information in our conversations that she felt was unwise to share publicly. But even when she did share, she would sometimes she would say, well, this thing I just said, I don't think that non-practitioners or non-meditators should hear this. I think that it should be for an advanced practitioner to hear. And you find this kind of need to know and this kind of elite status and kind of how in you are in the tradition. In the Goenka tradition, I think this is very much part and parcel of the organization in terms of how deep you are into either having authority or a position or long courses or practice, in terms of what information you start to get trusted with regards to the supernatural and the beyond the kind of rationalization that as you get deeper in, you have access to deeper knowledge that's not there from the outset of it. So I want to go back to this notion you brought up of the complexity of modernization. I think it's incredibly fascinating, not just as a topic in itself, but Lady, who represented all facets of this. I mean, Lady was doing so many things at once, and they weren't in contradiction to him, as you say that perhaps Goenka did not find this in contradiction either. Although as the tradition developed, students that came in maybe did have problems when things seemed like contradictory messages. But when we go back to Lady, you write that Lady Sayadaw's teachings on meditation, they can't be separated from the way that he was organizing and systematizing Buddhism at his time, that his effort was tied to the broader shaping of the Burmese Buddhist state. But you stress that this wasn't about stripping away myths or supernatural beliefs. It was still rooted in these essential Buddhist ideas of karma, cosmology, and protection. And so, can you walk us through what that looked like in practice? How that's different from the kind of modernization story that people assume? Because we also don't want to go too far the other way and say Lady was not presenting a modernist view. In many ways, he certainly was, but that we don't want to overcompensate for that. But as the narrative has gone, it seems like that's been picked up too far in the work that Lady was doing towards that modernization story.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've in some ways already spoken to this, um, but I think the main point is like what ideas become important for the traditions of practice that develop, right? So again, I can go to the Vipassana Dipani, this manual of insight, and I can read it. And if I take that as sort of what is the pinnacle of what the Ledi Sayadaw taught on meditation, then I can make Abhidhamma the center of his approach. Um, and that's well and good if I just read his texts, right? But then if I'm going to look at, what his students did, it looks different. And it turns out that on the ground, they were dealing with this day-to-day experiential stuff that tended to frame things in a much more kind of grounded and what we might think of as folk orientation, um, related to, different kinds of agencies, of various types of beings that were all sort of, working together. And I think in one way, like a simpler way of thinking about this is just to even think about how, Goenkaji set up his course structure, right? When the old students are at the front, the new students are at the back. Um, Sort of the teachers are up front, and things are arranged in this very particular way because there was an idea that like there's constant interaction between just like the magnetic fields of humans, right? And that has to be basically managed as part of the practice. Or this idea that Ubekin would bring his advanced students in to meditate with the newer students at key moments in practice in order to support them and help them, right? I mean, that's sort of basic way of thinking doesn't quite jive with a like more simple individualist idea that everything we're experiencing is completely bounded within us, right? On the other hand, it fits in fact very well with some deeper like scientific theories of like quantum relationships and stuff like that, which in fact weren't even so well developed at the time of Ubekin and Goenka. In many ways, would be better to help describe some of what they were up to than some of the folk theories they had. But the point is that it's when you get to the ground of what they were up to, like reading the scholastic manual and Abhidhamma is not going to probably give you a picture of what was really being enacted. I think that's the key issue there. And the language of modernity, it has its own place, and the discussion around like that concept is really important in other like formulations. But if we're trying to figure out what these practitioners were up to, it can just mislead us sometimes. There's another like way to go with this, which is of course, again, if we take this sort of like little notion of like quantum and connectivity that these guys were ahead of their time, and there was no language for what they were up to then. And now maybe we'll see something that's more helpful and accurate. And in fact, maybe they were more modern than we ever thought they could have been. But that's a whole nother kind of conversation. It is the kind of conversation that's happening in Buddhist studies circles now, where there's a whole relationship between Buddhist philosophy and quantum theory and stuff like that. But that's a whole nother sort of academic strain. And when we look at Goenka's language around scientific stuff, it was much more basic, right? He was focusing on very simple scientific ideas.
It's interesting talking about Goenka's decision to where the different students would sit in terms of the magnetic field that he would want to create, because it reminds me, I had the privilege some years ago of speaking to a very elder at that time Burmese man who was a very, very young disciple of Sayataji. And so he was actually able to explain some of his memory of Sayataji's courses. And there were various facts we got out of that. One of the things that comes to mind as you share that was that in his telling, when Sayataji would teach, the new students would sit in the front closest to the teacher, and the old students, the older the students were, the further and back that they would create. And the explanation that he gave was that this would also create a magnetic field, but as a sandwich. It would create a kind of sandwich between the spiritual strength of the teacher in front and the spiritual strength of the old students in back, where that would envelop the new students that were sitting in the middle and help along their practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great piece of evidence for different approaches, but with similar theoretical undergirdings.
Right. I want to touch on one point that you mentioned in this book, which I just found fascinating, and really the implications of this. You point out that for Ledi, the average person, quote, the average person is not capable of verifying religious truths on their own, that they need guidance from learned teachers, and only a few with a special karmic maturity are able to really make deeper progress. This felt to me, reading it, very different from how mindfulness is presented today as something that everyone can access equally, has the spiritual potential to do. And so from where we stand now in this more democratized field, how should we understand what Ledi was really doing, and the lessons or cautions this holds for how we understand mindfulness today and implications for teaching?
This also, of course, relates to questions about modernity also, and traditional models of hierarchy, etc. But it is one of those things that when we look broadly at the Ledi Sayadaw's teachings, it's hard to fully elucidate his position on this point, because in general, he's laying out just traditional models, right? And so we're trying to see that. And it's also hard to know if he's talking about just the human world or also the world of deities, or also the lower realms, etc., which he probably is including all of that when he talks about these developments. So I think the point to make, however, that that does shift, I think, Ledi in his moment from earlier times, is that he's definitely much more optimistic, despite there being this inherent hierarchy and this karmic baggage that people have, right? The shift still is that, now there still is this access to the sasana, right? When so many traditions had not talked on those terms, right? And there is this question, because in the context of Goenka, we have this explicit notion of revival, right? Which becomes much more clear, and which fits closer with some of the Weidza traditions. We're not so clear if the Ledi Sayadaw was quite participating in that kind of narrative, right? So that's where the focus I'm trying to make is that, actually, what happens with Goenka is, there's a direct connection back to Ledi, but actually some of the mythologizing shifts in a certain way, and it has other kinds of influences. And so that's like a bigger discussion, I would say.
Sure. Yeah, that's it's a thorny issue, and as you said from the outset, this is the messiness that you dig into that others situated in other places tend to avoid for their own reasons of what it is they're involved in and what they're doing. Just one more specific follow up question with that. There, you also mentioned that Lady sometimes said that people that are already strong in wisdom could bypass deep concentration practices. But elsewhere, he mentioned that most people of his time struggled with even basic morality and self restraint. And so, given that tension, do we have any understanding or do you have any guesses as to what training he might have expected ordinary lay people to follow? I think this is such an interesting question, also, just to set the context of the way that meditation is presented now is so the formality behind the set courses and the instructions and the guidelines and the practice. Every often when I get questions from people today about practice before, one of the first things I have to do is kind of take them out of the mindset of the formal meditation center, which obviously didn't exist then, and try to understand better just the very different context there. So given that context of a century ago, how different it was, and given some of these things that we've heard ladies say, what are your thoughts as to how he would have advised, or perhaps if he didn't actually do it, just his sense of what his expectations or aspirations or hopes were for what lay people could do in terms of practice at that time?
Yeah, well, I mean, at least the message we get from the history is that he thought they could do a lot, which is why like Mang Po Tet, his lay student, right? He encouraged him to teach and to teach lay people. Um, but I think in terms of just understanding, like when he's talking about basic morality, he's talking about the 5 precepts or the 8 precepts, and he's just saying like a lot of people aren't even going to be able to fully like do those because they're like living normal lives, and it's you run up against challenges in household life, right? But I would say that like his standard outlook is the one that like all of his lay students give, that the basic precepts are key, they're foundational, to and the taking the refuges are also key, like as part of the formal connection to the tradition, right? He was invested in those basic models, and he talks about that when he talks about teaching lay people, right? And then giving these particular teachings on the suttas. But yeah, I mean, I think the standard story that he thought lay people needed to practice more is for sure there.
Mm-hmm,
The question
mm-hmm.
of whether he envisioned like the kind of mass meditation that comes 50 years later or so, is the bigger question, right? But for sure, he saw something. He wanted to bring more lay people into these practices. There's no doubt about that. That's there. It's just a question of what his notion of like a meditation center might have been, for
Right.
instance, or what his, whether that was what he was up to. I mean, he was certainly a visionary. So, but we actually don't have enough evidence to be too clear on that. Um, but yeah, if he was teaching Mang Po Tet, at high levels,
Mm-hmm.
right, that's clear enough evidence of like what he thought was possible. But he, yeah, when we talk about mass movements, he's just saying like, yeah, most people are enmeshed you know, in the day-to-day lives, and it's hard to practice seriously, like when people aren't even taking the precepts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is also one of the reasons why there was this distinction between Buddhists and non-Buddhists for him, you know, which is something that's different from, say, Ubaken, who made this much clearer attempt to really bridge the traditions and say, well, these people who are not Buddhists have had these direct enlightenment experiences under me, right? That's a very clear shift in the terrain, and that's why I actually point to Ubaken as the key historical kind of actor in really internationalizing and also crossing religious boundaries with the Vipassana teachings.
That's really interesting. So, what do we know, if anything, about Lady's thoughts on teaching to non-Buddhists? And I mean, he corresponded with Westerners. This was colonial period, so he had greater access to understanding something more about the West through colonial Burma at that time. But as you mentioned, I mean, Khin spoke English, had IMC, International Meditation Center, with the understanding that there was a lot of places for Burmese Buddhists to study. He wanted to be able to provide an opportunity for those that were not Burmese and not Buddhist to be able to have the practice. So yeah, this was very much a part of his international mission. Do With all the reformulations and thinking and work that Lady Sayadaw did concerning all aspects of Buddhist thinking and practice and life, what can we glean out of what he understood of the access to that to non-Buddhists?
Yeah, it's not clear exactly how he thought on this, but again, he does explicitly talk about places like Rangoon being sort of challenging places, cosmologically speaking, precisely because they're filled with non-Buddhists. Right? You had,
Right.
and so I do think this is when we think about this idea of really sort of like different groups, like having different forces and stuff like this, which again was there. Um, I think that the Buddhism as a thing, even though it was a relatively new category, right? But it was something like I think he would maybe also these things would have become ethnic, related to ethnic identities too, which did happen also later on. So this is ongoing problematic dynamics. But yeah, I mean, the category of Buddhism was relatively new, but there was this idea of like, like the practice, people who practice in concord. So, for instance, like coming out to do the rituals that feed the spirits and help deal with plague, right, had to be done by people who were in concert, who had, common relationship to the cosmology.
Right. So then the last question I have for you here, which kind of ties this all together, is this concept of a birth of insight. And obviously, this is a phrase that you go into a lot in your book. It's the title of Eric Braun's book, and and there are various possible beginnings that we can look at that you bring up. The idea in the 18th century with Meidawi, a text with Lady's Manual of Insight in 1915, as a movement with the first lay meditation center in 1911, Mingun Jetavan Sayadaw, then later developed by Mahasi. So as we look at this concept of birth of insight, I guess first to unpack what do we mean by this? Why is it important? And which, in addition to some of these events and notions that I bring up here that you've written about, what key critical moments would you place and would you want to highlight in that?
Right. I mean, the main point of the book is to pull apart the idea, and again, if any one of those moments could be it, depending on how one defines the category, right? It shows how complex the process of these practices becoming global really was, right? And so, of course, what I'm doing is highlighting the role of Goenka and pointing out that actually it's like Ubakin's initial internationalization of the practice in the context, right, of his work community that was both Buddhist and non-Buddhist. So that's the first key element. And then Goenka's taking it out of Burma and particularly selling it in South Asia, and then going fully global, like having taught it to a lot of Westerners in particular in India, um, right? That actually, like, that's all the pieces only come together in those moments. Like, we have some of the pieces there in these earlier moments in Burma, But even Uba Khin it's not quite all there. And it's when, finally all the pieces come together and that category of insight comes into being with all these different factors at work. This is also just kind of an intellectual trick, what we call like the process of genealogy, right? Where you find something getting born or getting produced because you can see all the elements that make the category that you're trying to define, right? This is like a classic kind of mode of doing scholarship that has become, pretty influential and important in the humanities in the last, 100 years.
So with that, I thank you, Dan, for joining us once again to start to talk through this book, Insight and Perspective. Again, give a plug for listeners to check it out and get much more for there. And I look forward to some of our ongoing conversations, continuing to go through history and uncover some of the really incredible information and analysis that you bring out here.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
We've come to the end of this discussion, and we thank you for spending your last couple of hours with us. I also want to let you know that we've recorded a lot more discussions that touch on similar themes to what was explored today. This is because over the years, we've curated a rich archive now numbering in the hundreds of episodes, freely available to all. Among these are in-depth conversations with guests who explore Buddhist teachings and meditation practices, shedding light on the profound spiritual traditions that are deeply woven into Myanmar's culture. These discussions offer insights into mindfulness, compassion, and spiritual development, timeless principles that resonate far beyond the borders of the Golden Land. However, producing and preserving this archive requires significant time and resources, and we rely on listeners like you to help sustain it. If you found inspiration or guidance in today's episode, or from any of the wealth of teachings and meditative reflections maintained in our archive, we invite you to support our work. Your generosity helps us to continue production and to share these valuable conversations, while ensuring that this resource remains freely available to all who seek it. Visit insightmyanmar.org/donation to make a contribution.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam